Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the DE&I Black History presentation for today. My name is Kia Gilmore. I am a legal assistant in the Washington, D.C. office, and I work with the education and financial regulatory services groups. And I'm also a co-chair on the Black professional staff affinity group. I also have with me our other facilitator. Her name is Dejan. Dejan Ogaro, and Dejan is an associate in our Washington, D.C. office as well. I have the pleasure today of introducing our guest speaker. His name is Brent Leggs. Brent is the executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, the largest preservation campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places. Through the Action Fund, he leads a broad community of leaders and activists in honor of the clarion that preserving African American cultural sites is fundamental to understanding the American story. He is also an associate professor and senior advisor at the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Brent is a Harvard University Loeb Fellow, author of Preserving African American Historic Places, and the 2018 recipient of the Robert G. Stanton National Preservation Award. His effort to protect Madam C.J. Walker's Villa Lawaro in New York and to create the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument in Alabama, which President Barack Obama designated in 2017, is exemplary of his successful campaigns to protect many cultural monuments throughout the US. We're gonna have also a question and answer portion at the end that'll be led by Dejan Ogaro. You can ask questions in the chat or send your questions through the chat, and then Dejan will take over the question and answer after Brent is finished. Brent, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Hello, everybody at Cooley. I am honored to share this space and time with you. What I wanted to do is to first help introduce myself and to share my personal journey and how I came to this work. All right, let me see if my PowerPoint will move. All right. Let me try this again. There we go. So for me, it's all about the why. So I'm from a little town called Paducah, Kentucky. And as you can imagine, my family, we didn't sit around the dinner table talking about cultural preservation as a profession and the technical language of Section 106 and how you protect Black culture in perpetuity. But when I think of my very first connection to race, place, and identity, I'm reminded what happened in the third grade. So my mom, as a professional development exercise, would have me and my twin brother introduce ourselves when we were enrolling in school. And I went up to the administrator and I said, "Hi, my name is Brent Leggs." She said, "What's your address?" And I said, 741 McGuire Avenue. She said, "What apartment number?" And I said, 741. Now I'm noticing that my mom is getting irritated. And my mom didn't get irritated with other adults. It was just mainly with her children. And I would realize that she assumed because we were Black that we lived in public housing. See, McGuire Avenue is a long street. At the far end was public housing. But in 1972, my parents had built their own house. It was a red ranch style brick home that they were very proud of and really represented their aspirations for themselves and their children. As I look back this really was the first memory of racial bias in relationship to race, place, and identity. Fast track, years later, I would go to the University of Kentucky. I thought I was going to be a corporate tycoon on Wall Street and make a bunch of money. Ended up getting a master's in business and finance and realized that didn't fit my personality. So I started the process of soul searching for my professional identity. And when I mean soul searching, I thought I was going to get a PhD in marketing, a PhD in history. I even looked at philosophy and realized I needed to speak a second language fluently in a second language. So I scrapped that idea. And I thought I discovered it, which was a furniture making class and program inside the School of Architecture. When I walked inside that hall, I had this random unintentional conversation with the Dean of the Graduate Preservation Program, Dr. Dennis Domer. That's an old white guy with a beard, like literally down to here. And in our short conversation, he said that I'd be the first African-American to go into this program. First person with an MBA. That because the historic redevelopment, kind of loft development was on trend, that I could use federal historic tax credits and, in his words, make a shitload of money, and that I would get the highest scholarship. So I said, yeah, this sounds fantastic to me. And 2 months later, I was studying architectural history and iconic columns and questioning whether or not I made the right decision. But thankfully, they asked me to conduct this statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. Now, I had read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery and was inspired by his life. A man formerly enslaved would create an institution known as Tuskegee Institute at that time. We call it Tuskegee University today in Alabama. But I had no idea that born in his mind was a social movement that we called Rosenwald schools today. They stand as a social movement, as a physical manifestation of a social movement in response to a crisis in Black education. He collaborated with Julius Rosenwald, who was a Jewish American and empathetic of the Black experience. And together they would help to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. The original landscape designer was George Washington Carver. The original architect was America's first African-American licensed architect, Robert Taylor. This is an example where architecture and racial justice intersect. It is the most amazing story. And I remember standing at a Rosenwald school, literally being held up by a tree and having this multi-sensory experience with its history in this place. As I toured the inside, I could hear the creaking floorboards. I could see the sunlight shining through the broken window panes. I could even smell decay. But I started to realize that there was this untapped potential for preservation, that there was a transcendent quality to this work. That transcendence is because preservation reduces the gap between space and time. I started to realize, because my parents attending Rosenwald schools, that Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my own life because of my family connection. I started to understand that preservation makes Washington and Rosenwald's lives once lived real. And I have asked myself this question ever since. What is my social responsibility to help create a more equitable and just society? So I love this quote from cultural icon Beyonce. These words come from her visual album, Lemonade, and I want you to keep this in mind. The past and the future merge to meet us here. White America enslaved Black America for 250 years, creating a social disease that stains all aspects of our society. We continue to fight this legacy. In 1853, Pamela Cunningham, she would create an organization called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Together, these women would help to save and restore the home of George Washington. In essence, this birthed the U.S. preservation movement. It also led to the beginning of inequity within our national inventory of historic places. Currently today, the more than 100,000 places listed in our National Register of Historic Places, only 2% reflects the Black experience in America. We are fighting against cultural inequity and erasure. We are fighting against urban renewal. Can you imagine the loss of financial capital and the loss of culture because of urban renewal? You know, I'm coming to mind, I'm thinking about the historic Deep Deuce neighborhood that Ralph Ellison would write about in Oklahoma City, where 2,000 residential and commercial properties were erased through this inequitable practice. We are fighting against redlining and disinvestment. So the National Community Reinvestment Coalition reports, for decades, low-income and minority communities were intentionally cut off from lending and investment through a system known as redlining. Today, those same neighborhoods suffer not only from reduced wealth and greater poverty, but from lower life expectancy and higher rates of chronic disease that are risk factors for COVID. You can imagine how living in this kind of historic built environment impacts our health and our wellness. We're fighting against extreme forms of racism and violence. This is Mother Emanuel in Charleston, and we all remember what happened in 2015 when a white nationalist would assassinate 9 church members praying inside of this sacred space. I'm glad to say that we have invested $150,000 to help this congregation restore their historic sanctuary. We're fighting against disrespect. This building is in Nantucket, Massachusetts. It stands as the second oldest extant Black church building in the United States. And this is how some Americans express their cultural values in public space. This happened in 2018. This cultural reckoning that happened last summer, I would be remiss if I didn't say his name, George Floyd. We're fighting against symbols of hate, whether nationally or internationally. So I've given a lot of thought to this, and I wanted to read something from an op-ed that I wrote in the Art newspaper. I start by using a quote from Pablo Picasso, who once said, "Art is the lie that enables us to realize the truth." Let the connection between public spaces and Confederate statues disappear, with ruins that will never be maintained again. These sites of conscience will remind nations never to forget the power of propaganda and racial politics cloaked with heritage and carried out with violence. Like an hourglass, where each falling grain of sand is pulled to the bottom by larger forces. Let this community of false heroes enjoy their own decay. Because the truth is that in The reality of this moment, Confederate monuments and their pride and prejudice are a vanishing history. I wonder if there's a global reconciliation strategy to be able to confront how art and statues and heritage has been used to weaponize and even colonize public space. And we are fighting against systemic racism. In the shadows of the White House last summer, an unnamed protester would write these words on the side of the Decatur House here in Washington, D.C. This place is a National Trust historic site where African Americans were once held in bondage. And this protester wrote, "Why do we have to keep telling you Black lives matter?" This is our work. And my tool is to respond to this using landscapes and old buildings and stories. So history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Preservation as social justice. I have the good fortune of being the founding executive director of the largest preservation campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places. It was created in the aftermath of the tragic events that happened in Charlottesville. And we all remember this image where white men wearing khaki pants and polo shirts and holding tiki torches rallied around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of the University of Virginia, where they connected culture, heritage, and violence as a way to advocate for a new form of Jim Crow. We thought that this was an injustice. It was one of the rare moments that historic preservation was part of a national discourse. And we wanted to demonstrate that preservation was a tool for affecting positive social change. In essence, we are working to confront the miseducation of Americans and to redefine a new American culture and narrative. So this is the mission of the Action Fund. We are about creating space within our own understanding of history, preservation, and social justice. We are about creating positive change in communities across the United States. Now, the first thing that we did was create a National Advisory Council. It's mainly a 20-member board of the Action Fund. It's co-chaired by Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation, and actor and director, Miss Phylicia Rashad. I want to highlight one of our members, and that is Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who is the first African-American to chair the history department at Harvard University, same program where Dr. Carter G. Woodson graduated. Dr. Carter G. Woodson is the father of Black history as an academic field and the founder of Black History Week, which we know today as Black History Month. It is an honor to work with these esteemed individuals who share a vision for elevating the contributions of Black Americans in American history. Now, it takes money to preserve places, and we're building a coalition of financial support and investors, these social impact leaders that understand the value of this work. Our largest investor is the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation at $7 million. And I'm glad to say in just 3 years, we have raised $25 million. We are just completing phase 1 of the Action Fund, having supported 150 preservation projects nationally. We're also strategically engaging with the media as a way to build a national ethic for the preservation of African American historic places. Now I want to talk about the work. We We all know James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution. This is his home in Virginia. If you get a chance to see the permanent exhibition titled A Mere Distinction of Color, that brings life to the story of the enslaved workers there, but also highlights the legacies of slavery over centuries. That in itself is powerful. But we also wanted to demonstrate this shared authority strategy. So the descendant community, who is now incorporated through their own nonprofit, is working with the foundation to develop a shared governance strategy that we hope will become a national model for other traditional sites. We've all heard of President Woodrow Wilson, another National Trust historic site. He is well known for his international policies that still benefit the world today. He's also known for being a segregationist president who segregated the federal government. So we worked with African American artists and practitioners, and they created a new composition that highlighted the DC counter-protest movement of the 1960s, performed it using Wilson's own piano inside of his house. This is how we reimagine the cultural legacies here in the United States and reclaim space. If anybody is from Richmond, Virginia, then you probably are aware of the efforts to reimagine an amazing and complicated cultural landscape known as Shockoe Bottom. If you tour it today, it's nothing more than parking lots and concrete, and you would have no idea that this was once the second largest slaveholding center in the United States, that an African burial ground is there, that it was the former place of the Lumpkin slave jail. So we ask ourselves, when the physical evidence is no longer visible, how do we commemorate this history and this culture? We have worked with the community to develop a community-driven vision for memorialization that links together economic development and education. And this is what they envision. Preservation is equity. Our signature program, or pillar of the Action Fund, is our national grant program. And I think these statistics highlight that African American historic places continue to be underfunded and undervalued. Almost 2,400 proposals requesting almost $250 million. And this doesn't even really touch the overall need for stewarding these historic places. So we've been able to invest in 65 places and communities and invest almost $5 million. We'll invest at a minimum an additional $1.6 million in July. And we've been able to support projects like the Paul Robeson House that's in Philadelphia. This organization sees themselves in this space as a cultural anchor for this community. And we help them hire their very first paid executive director. We're working at places like the home of Alice and John Coltrane. Inside of this house is where John composed his greatest masterpiece, A Love Supreme. He spent a week in their second floor bedroom and created this piece of art. Many Americans don't realize that his wife, Alice, is an accomplished musician herself. She recorded her first 5 albums in their basement studio. Our work here is to equalize these dual narratives and to elevate Alice's contribution in American jazz and to ensure that both legacies are preserved and honored. I wonder if anyone has heard of the Hill District in Pittsburgh or the story of playwright August Wilson. You probably have seen the movie Fences, which was based on one of his plays. This is an example of how art and place creates power and community. Because of the spatial limitations inside the house, they are using the landscape and the streetscape as a way to bring the community together around this culture and heritage. So for anyone in Los Angeles, I hope that you can support the Whiffendale Ladies Club. I think this is one of the most beautiful stories because during the period of segregation, 50 Black women came together, pooled their resources and money. They bought this elegant 2-story house to create their own social space. This is representative of the Black middle class, a story that is often unknown and overlooked. It's also a story of how Black women create their own space and power. Has anyone heard about Pauli Murray? I'll have to say that not until about 5 years ago had I ever heard about Pauli Murray. Come to find out that Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, dedicated her first Supreme Court brief in Pauli Murray's memory. Pauli Murray is the one that termed the word Jane Crow to talk about the discrimination impacting Black women during Jim Crow and segregation. She is a powerhouse, first African-American Episcopal saint, co-founder of National Organization of Colored Women. The remarkable achievements of this woman, and it started in this house, which is being restored and will be opened up next year as the Pauli Murray Center for Social Justice. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, stands the last remnant of the largest racial massacre in the United States. In the historic Greenwood neighborhood, after the massacre, the Black community began to rebuild and started the process of restoring the church. I'm glad that we have invested $150,000 to help them to repair the stained glass windows. What's important to note here is that there are other stories beyond the trauma and the violence. Greenwood was considered the Negro Wall Street, a phrase termed by Booker T. Washington. There are dual narratives, and our work is to balance public memory here, struggle and achievement. Roberts Temple is where the civil rights movement was catalyzed because of the bravery of one woman, Mamie Till. Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. His funeral was held at Roberts Temple in Chicago. His mother made the decision to have an open casket funeral. And those horrific images shocked and shifted the consciousness of America. If you're ever in Memphis, I hope you will stop by Claiborne Temple. This is where the sanitation workers strike, where 15,000 protesters led by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968 would protest to the courthouse. This was an example when the civil rights movement became more sophisticated, and it wasn't just about political activism, it also was about economic justice. And inside the basement is where the I Am Man posters were developed and pressed. I'm glad to say that we are supporting them in hiring their first preservation manager. We helped establish the nonprofit organization that oversees the stewardship of this site, and Claiborne Temple has a bright future ahead of it. Now, I'm sure you have heard about Nina Simone. Nina Simone transcended the constraints placed on Black female performers in the mid 20th century to become the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. Her artistry started inside of this humble, unadorned house. This house is reflective of many African American historic places that at first glance don't seem to hold a lot of significance and meaning. But if you pull back the layers, you'll discover a life force that has not only inspired American civil rights, but her contributions in world music is to be honored and remembered. We're working with 4 New York City-based visual artists who own the property, and they believe this work is a form of arts activism and politics. So I want to highlight just 2 projects that are dear to me and the work of preserving American culture. So in Irvington, New York stands an elegant historic residence that embodies the optimism and perseverance of American entrepreneurship. It is the home of Madam C.J. Walker, America's first self-made female millionaire. Madam Walker created a formula to help Black women's hair grow and to be healthy. She would employ and train almost 23,000 sales agents in the United States, South America, and across the Caribbean. In 1918, at a cost of $250,000, she would integrate the most expensive zip code in the United States at the time, build this house on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, considered the most significant Gothic architecture in America, and 3 miles from the Rockefeller estate, Kykuit. This place holds tremendous power, and in her will, she said, "I leave this place in memoriam as a museum or monument to inspire my race to reach its highest potential." A building designed by architect Vertner Tandy, who was the first licensed Black architect in the state of New York, co-founder of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. The multiple layers of stories and histories imbued within this place will live on in perpetuity. And I'm glad to say that the National Trust now holds a preservation easement on Villa Lewaro, and this ensures that this elegant estate will look like this forever. Look at this. I wish I could just take you on a virtual tour of how beautiful this place is. And then there are places like the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama. This is where Black men, women, and children in 1963, in the spring of 1963, would develop the Birmingham campaign known as Project C. And they would implement it out of this motel that was owned by A.G. Gaston. He constructed it in 1954, the most successful Black entrepreneur during the period of segregation. And I bet he could never foresee that the American Civil Rights Movement would descend on this, occupy this space, and as a result, break the back of segregation across the South. What I think is powerful about this space is it represents the power of Black America and our allies, given that this community was only armed with the truth in a spiritual battle against immorality. They would test and affirm the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. They influence public policy locally and nationally, and I'm delighted to say that this motel now stands as the centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument and ensures that these stories are forever remembered. So it's important in this moment that we create space for Black leaders and ideas. We do this through our fellowship program. I'm sure you are doing that at Cooley as well. It's an opportunity to give new leaders an opportunity to lead. We're doing this through our HOPE Crew, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience, where we work with youth between the ages of 18 to 25, and we introduce them to preservation trades, the basics of carpentry and construction. And this is what it looks like, paid positions. And hopefully this fills a gap because a lot of the qualified conservators are aging in place. And we hope to inspire the next generation of qualified crafts professionals in the US. And we're also working at historically Black colleges and universities. We partnered with the National Endowment for Humanities and others to pilot this year $1 million HBCU initiative. And just last week, we made our announcement that we partnered with 8 HBCUs. We're funding preservation planning activities, but also as important, we are working with their schools of design as an opportunity to cultivate the next generation of Black professionals that will follow in my own footsteps and others to be able to move this work forward in the future. So I feel like this is how we begin the process of building a true national identity. And quoting Dr. Carter G. Woodson, what we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of national bias, race, hate, and religious prejudice. I believe that we can aspire to realize Dr. Carter G. Woodson's vision for our nation. If we begin the work of revering and uplifting Black culture and the historic assets that hold those stories as American history, that's how we begin the process of truth and reconciliation. We must collaborate to partner with intention to reduce historical inequities. And we must develop measurable, quantifiable, equity-driven outcomes. This is our American story. During Black History Month, now and into the future, we will continue to say their names, past and even those from recent memory. We honor them. So I want to leave you with this. The past and the present merge to meet us here. What future can we create together to imagine a more just and equitable society? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent, for your presentation and for being with us today. I think I speak on behalf of many of us that we learned a lot and appreciate the efforts that you and your organization are putting forward to preserve Black history. We did get a series of questions while you were presenting, and so I'll go through them with the remaining time that we have. The first one is, how can Cooley and other lay people play a role in preserving Black history?
I would say the first thing is to be curious. I mean, I can imagine that you have African-American historic places or sites related to Latino American history or other diverse stories. Google on the website and find out what stories that they are telling and interpreting. Join the board if you have some free time and talent that you want to share to that nonprofit. Donate money. But I think for me, the most important thing is just be curious to want to know more about the full American story.
Great, thanks so much. The next question that we have is, how do you decide which locations to preserve which ones to invest in given resource constraints, but also just the sheer volume of institutions that really need to be preserved. And second to that, when someone does donate to sort of help with these preservation efforts, can they stipulate or request or direct the use of funds?
Yes. So restricted donations to the Action Fund are welcome. We are moving into phase 2, and I am proud to share in confidence with you that I received word that the Ford Foundation and our co-chair, Darren Walker, is investing $3 million to begin seeding phase 2 campaign, which is another $25 million. So it's funny how these projects, I have to say that it's almost like they literally are some divine intervention in the way the Joe Frazier's Gym or Hinchliffe Stadium or the Gaston and Villa Lawara have come to me. But mostly we have our national grant program, we promote, we invite, and now that we're starting to get so much exposure in the media, we are just inundated with requests for technical assistance and communities wanting to collaborate. So it depends on the scale of our intervention. You know, if it's the low level kind of technical assistance, or if it's a demonstration project, these are multi-year campaigns. Hinchliffe Stadium, which is the Negro League ballpark in Paterson, New Jersey, that was 5 years. We have been working on Nina Simone and Coltrane now for more than 3 years. And so we try to select a small group of nationally significant places where there is a deep commitment locally and where we think the business models and the work has the potential to be replicated nationally.
And we have a very popular question. What is your view on remaining, keeping, preserving, knocking down? What is your take on the appropriate action for statues, Confederate flags, things of that nature that many people in marginalized communities find offensive given the history of those items?
Yeah, you know, I have gone back and forth about this topic. And you can imagine as a preservationist, I mean, to say we support the removal of a historic statue is pretty provocative in many ways. I understand the truth of this history and that they were used as a psychological weapon against Black people in public space. And I don't believe that they should, in personal belief, that they should hold the prominence of public space. That's why, in my view, relocating them to a designated landscape where all of the conflicted statues can stand together, where we make a conscious decision as a nation never to invest any public investment in their maintenance and care. And that as they decay over time, we can measure our social progress. So for me, if we can think of a radical vision that leads to truth and reconciliation, that really is the power in this moment. And for me, the second part of the opportunity is, what are the overlooked stories that currently don't reside in public space? How can we fill gaps across the American cultural landscape and in history and bring recognition to Black women and other women inside of those spaces? What does it say to have Harriet Tubman standing in front of a magnificent historic courthouse? So that for me is kind of what I think. And then the one thing that I haven't found the answer to is, how can we ensure that future generations, once these statues are relocated, that they never forget the trauma that was created and how art was used in such a negative and violent way?
Great, thanks. Is there a list of sites that you've mentioned here or other sites that you would recommend that people can visit, learn about, Is there a repository or list of those locations?
I would just say you can browse our website at savingplaces.org, and there isn't a repository yet. It's funny, me and a colleague were actually having this conversation yesterday about that, and it's one of our it's on our short list of things to do.
Okay. What role and responsibility do you believe that preservationists have for places like the plantations at Mount Vernon, Monticello, and other places to educate about the horrors and conditions of those locations? This question comes from someone who's visited many of these plantation sites and actually found that very little of them spend any time talking about the day-to-day experiences of enslaved people. And I'll just add in my own thing, except Whitney Plantation from my home state, which is dedicated to the actual experience of enslaved people. But what do you think is the role of the plantations and preservationists to sort of shift the amount of time and space that's focused on the experience of all the people who resided in those historical places?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I will first say that these traditional sites, and I have witnessed this firsthand, white fragility. So visitors come here wanting to be educated about a president or a business person, and they want to be disconnected from the painful truth and the legacies of slavery. And that discomfort also has resulted in about a 15% loss for the historic sites that have made a commitment to telling the full story and a commitment to equitable interpretation. So I applaud Montpelier. I applaud Whitney for being really at the forefront of this work, and others. For me, I think what's most important is using this as an opportunity to engage the descendant community. And I'm seeing this at the Shadows on the Teche. I'm seeing this at so many places where descendants in the broadest sense are now being reconnected back to this site. They are personally discovering their own family legacies and histories. My personal interest is, again, the Black experience is often so stereotypically defined, even if it's highlighting slavery. I want to be able to reveal the stories of Black resistance during slavery. I want to be able to tell stories of Black agency and self-determination. Like at Fort Monroe, for example, this is where the first slave ship arrived in 1619. You fast forward to 1861, and you had 3 enslaved Black men who, through their own self-determination, would escape slavery and bondage, inspire 500,000 freedom seekers in their footsteps. They would be declared contraband of war by Union General Benjamin Butler. And he has become the kind of the hero of this story and positioned as an actor in history. While those 3 men's story, they are positioned as spectators in history. How can we shift that paradigm to tell stories like this where we are uplifting that agency and self-emancipation? I feel like those are the kinds of stories that empower visitors that tour sites of painful and difficult histories.
Can any of these preserved places be explored online?
Yeah, they can. You know, the one benefit of COVID is that the majority of historic sites have had to be innovative, and the amount of digital programming and new content production is pretty amazing. So yeah, I would say browse any particular site of interest, and I'm sure they have some pretty great program right now.
Throughout your presentation, you talked a lot about culture, heritage, and violence. Can you talk about how those 3 elements are represented in our collective sense of place and our individual sense of place?
Yeah, I think if you look at the American landscape over 4 centuries, and this is taking the stats from Ta-Nehisi Coates as a case for reparations, but 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, I think 35 years of separate but equal. The American landscape is a racist landscape, but it's also a landscape that highlights the ideals, art, and the hope of America through the lens of the Black experience and other diverse experiences. And so when I walk through the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, that where you have the A.G. Gaston Motel on the corner of the block, you've got 16th Street Baptist Church, you've got Kelly Ingram Park. Like, I don't walk through that space feeling heavy or feeling like I'm in a racist space. I walk in that space and I am inspired by the power of the Black community to organize and to have that shared vision and consolidate those limited resources and to sustain a commitment to that vision. That's the culture that I'm working to preserve versus the violence and what is painful. So it's all about balance, I think.
And it looks like we had one more question just come through. Are you using local municipal historical preservation ordinances to prevent these sites from being hit by the wrecking ball while you're raising funds for renovation? For example, the person raising this question knows that in New Orleans, the musical Oasis, the Dewdrop Inn still stands, but it's decaying and maybe at risk of being torn down. So what are you doing during the pendency of planning for those renovations?
That's a really good question. My first strategy for engagement is protection. We got to first protect to buy time for the future preservation of sites, because we will see additional erasure. And I would share, and I hope that you can convey, if you are connected in New Orleans, to the property owner or the advocates around this, seek local landmark designation. It provides protection from demolition, and it provides protection against adverse alterations in the building. And that would be the first strategy for helping to ensure this building isn't demolished. Second is you could seek a determination of eligibility within the National Register. And if any public funding is being proposed to be used for demolition, that triggers Section 106. Gets a little technical and wonky, but at least we'll buy additional time.
Great, and let's see. Here's another question. Are you working to preserve more modern sites representative to the Black struggle for equality? For example, the home of Fred Hampton, former chair of the Black Panther Party in Chicago.
All right, somebody's reading my mind and desire. So when we think of like the civil rights movement, there are some gaps still in this story. And it's unfortunate how we as a nation have misinterpreted or communicated the true meaning of the Black Panther Party movement. That organization, that history just turned 50 a couple of years ago. So technically, the spaces associated to that history is deemed historic. And we are in conversations with an organization that is working to preserve the childhood home of Fred Hampton in Chicago. And I would love to see this site become, a centerpiece for being able to reimagine how we interpret the story of the Black Panther Party movement.
This may be the last one that we have time for, but I'll combine two of them. How would you change the way that history is taught in universities? And what do you think we should be teaching about the Black Lives Matter movement and its future?
I think it's so important that we begin in this moment to document that movement. It literally is a movement that is transforming not only the United States, but the world. So marching the protest routes in cities across America, documenting the ephemeral when we think of the George Floyd Memorial, and we provided 50,000 to the city of Minneapolis to be able to do that kind of work. But I would say within our educational system, it's time that we evaluate the pedagogy. And it's time that we do a deep evaluation with a team of scholars that reimagines the way that we educate and teach history in the United States. It needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be more truthful. And until that work happens, it's even more important that we have historic assets that stand to be able to fill in those gaps.
Amazing. So thank you everyone in the chat for sending in questions, the documentaries, the links. There's been several comments thanking you for your presentation and saying that it's informative and educational. And you can look out for a post, everyone. That's our internal intranet that will have this recording, more links and information. If you're interested in donating, there's also information and links in the chat. Thank you so much again, and thank you everyone for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.